It's a trucking, transportation, and lifestyle show like none other.
Man, you call this a life?
Road Gang Radio is back for another half hour of the best transpo show in the known universe.
We come in peace. Well, actually, we're falling to pieces.
Let's see if we can achieve liftoff, Phone Master Dre.
To infinity and beyond, a.k.a. Lindsay and Jimmy. Hello again.
No, hi, hello.
Hello. We're all over here at Declare.
Automatically think a Rocky Horror Picture Show.
At the late night double feature picture show, which by the way is 50 years old this year, in case anybody didn't know. Rocky Horror Picture Show. You're now dating yourself, everybody. If you went and saw it, man, you're an old person right now. You be old. All the Leaves Are Brown, How the Mamas and the Papas Came Together and Broke Apart, of course, is the semi-biography. I don't know what to call it. It is an amazing history book, by the way, detailing the work of the Mamas and the Papas and how they kind of came to be and how they kind of came to unravel. And, of course, Scott Shea is a longtime radio producer who currently works on the show Seize the Day with Gus Lloyd on Sirius XM on the Catholic Channel. He has produced 6 original audio documentaries that have aired nationally. For the purposes of this show, by the way, though, he is a nonpareil journalist in the field of rock and roll, kind of capturing the world from whether it's the Monterey Pop Festival or why Van Morrison simply cannot listen to certain of his songs ever again without punching his hand through a wall. The article we're talking about today is pretty extraordinary, Lindsay. We love Scott. He's a regular contributor over here, and we are glad to have him aboard. Scott Shea, welcome back to Road Gang Radio.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me back on, man. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Love having you, Scott. And we alluded to the man behind the band, behind the song this morning a little bit, but I can't wait to dive in this to you as it pertains to actually current, what's happening in the Nashville songwriting scene and just songwriting scene in general. But before we go there, we have to sort of break this down a bit. And, you know, when Jimmy Page turned Jake Holmes, took his Dazed and Confused into a Zeppelin staple, it changed the trajectory of that song forever. So as a songwriter myself, I think about the way songs like move around in Nashville, and I'll get some examples in a minute. But let's just start with for our listeners, how did Jimmy Page even stumble, quite literally, upon Jake and this song?
Well, it went back to when he was with the Yardbirds in 1967. He'd been with them for about a year, maybe a little bit longer. And they were in the United States on a tour, and they played Greenwich Village, the Village Theater. And Jake Holmes and the Youngbloods also of Get Together opened for him. And Jim McCarty, the drummer of the Yardbirds, took in the show. He was the only one. And he heard Jake perform Dazed and Confused, which he had just released on his first album, The Above Ground Sound of Jake Holmes. And he went out the next day and bought the record and played it for the band. And they all loved it. And they said, hell, let's try to work out a arrangement, a live version for ourselves and play it. And they did. And they played it a lot. They never recorded it, but they played it a lot. And they played it the way Jake wrote it. Like they hadn't changed. Jimmy completely changed the lyrics for Led Zeppelin. The only thing he kept was I've been dazed and confused for so long, you know. And but, you know, he also took that loping, descending bass chord, you know, augmented by Jimmy's guitar that Jake introduced, and the overall moodiness of the song. So that's how it all kind of came together.
It is interesting because, you know, Lindsay and I, before we did a segment of, the comments that our callers kind of write, and we talked for a few minutes about this. This is a man in Jake who is almost unclassifiable. I mean, in a time when everything was fluid, in a time when there were so many unique and different sorts of artists and sounds coming into the game and coming into perspective, he is so weird in regards to his talent. He's an amazingly talented person. We were talking about David Lynch the other day. This is just one of those incredibly unique, strange talents where it's like he's the kind of guy, if he was an interior decorator, he's the one that walks into your house, removes one picture, replaces it with the weirdest darn thing, rolls up one carpet, replaces one carpet, and you go, oh my God, the room works. He's that guy. I mean, and I don't know if that's fair, but I mean, as I read this article, I said, oh my God, this is Lindsay's kind of guy right here. I mean, this is a guy who just sees the world differently. I mean, it's as if he is looking at the world through a very different set of filters. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment of who he was?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. The David Lynch comparison is spot on because he can make something like really commercial, like the Twin Peaks series, and then make like Fire Walk with Me or something. It's just like completely abstract.
Inland Empire. What the hell? Yeah, what the hell? God Almighty.
But Jake is the same way. I mean, when I went back when I started writing the article, I went back and listened to his 2 albums that he released on Tower Records. The Above Ground Sound and something December. I can't remember
A Letter to Catherine December. I had to write them both down. The Above Ground Sound is like the Above Ground Sound of Jake Holmes, and A Letter to Catherine December. And I mean, Lindsay, the word that he uses is unclassifiable. That's exactly it. I was like, what in the hell are these albums?
Yeah, and I went back and I listened to them, and they were enjoyable and they're good, but they were completely unclassifiable. I couldn't even say, well, is it pop? Is it psychedelic? Is it folk? We love these subcategories, and Jake is just being himself. But at the same time, he writes like "Be all that you can be" for the U.S. Army, and "Raise your hand if you're sure," and "Be a pepper" for Dr. Pepper. Guy became a great advertising. Right? So it's like. And then he almost has a hit a couple in the early 70s, But then, and then Jimmy takes his Dazed and Confused and makes it like a rock anthem. Like I said in the article, Led Zeppelin has a catalog of signature songs, and that's arguably their most signature song.
Well, it is because I'll tell you this, Scott. I would when I was in a sorority in Oklahoma, in Norman, Oklahoma, a little sorority. I went and was walking to class one day and saw a Post-it note on a tree that said "band looking for singer," and for some reason this little innocent girl thought it was a good idea to show up at a bunch of dudes in a garage that were jamming through a puff of smoke in their garage, and I was like, I am here to audition. And they about lost their mind. We're like, you are not what we thought would walk in the door. And they were just like jamming. And I sang the one Led Zeppelin song that I knew, which was Dazed and Confused, and got the gig. They were like they were kind of shocked that I even knew it. I was shocked that I even knew it, if I'm being honest. Why is that song something that little innocent Christian girl from Texas, why would I have known that song? Why is that the one that screams in everybody's ears, would you say?
Well, it's very well known. It was never released as a single, but it was a highlight of that first album, and that album is pretty great, and it just drew people in. It's almost kind of like Thunder Road on like Born to Run. It's like as popular as Born to Run, but it wasn't released as a single, So my brother was a huge Zepp head when we were kids, and I remember him being fascinated by Dazed and Confused. He would play it over and over. And I remember he was the one who first told me about the whole Jake Holmes thing years ago, and the Yardbirds recording it. And he just did this deep dive into the origins of the song, So it's just one of those things. To me, it's that descending bass line that just builds up into this massive crescendo of just guitars and bass and the rhythm section, and it's just and it's as cool as it is that Jake Holmes wrote it. I can understand, like, Jimmy really wrote the lyrics to it, and those lyrics are really transcended. And he certainly improved on the song. I guess my only bone to pick with him, and obviously so many others, is that he just for some reason was so stubborn in giving Jake Holmes any kind of credit for it for so long.
It's a weird thing because you have two men who absolutely, and Page, by the way, is another example of this. Page actually sees the world in a very different rhythm. He sees it in a very, sort of, Page wasn't Page the one who actually goes over to North Africa and, ends up like, in the middle of some kind of strange adventure. And you literally have one weirdo appropriating the music of another weirdo. So you're talking about a double filter. It would be like Federico Fellini getting his work stolen by David Lynch. Oh, wait, that does happen. But you know what I'm saying? I mean, there really is a sense of this is what happens when two visionaries get their hands on something and then transform it throughout the process. I didn't know the story, and I was like, this was madness in some ways, because there's nothing about Jake that suggests Led Zeppelin, is there?
No, not at all. You know, I mean, he was the complete opposite. He was much more, you know, Zeppelin as you know, in the uncommercial, as hip as being uncommercial in the 70s was, Led Zeppelin was pretty commercial. Let's face it. You know, they were commercially uncommercial, I guess you could say. You know, but Jake was just completely uncommercial. You know, and just it's an interesting pairing. You know, and but I can see, you know, you can see obviously what drove Jimmy to that song. But it's weird because there's nothing else in Jake's canon that suggests, you know, that something like that would become so big. He's as good of a songwriter and singer as he was.
Scott, so we're talking now more about credit and ownership in music. You know, Taylor Swift re-recording her catalog and lawsuits over songwriting credits, et cetera. Actually, my very dear friend was married to Mark Volman, who we just lost of the Turtles. Yes, she was 25 years younger than him. And he had, you know, he and the Turtles had a huge lawsuit, a class action over Sirius XM that they got paid out on.
Right.
So all this stuff is happening. Actually, I would love for you, if you'd be interested, whether it be write an article or come back and talk about Mark Volman, just since he's in my vortex over here. I'd be very curious your take on that. Sidebar for another day. But I'm curious, do you think, not that Holmes had a lawsuit against Led Zeppelin necessarily, I don't think, but do you think he ever got his due in the bigger picture, or does his legacy live more in the influence itself rather than the name recognition, I assume?
Well, yeah, he did have a lawsuit.
He did, okay.
It took a while. In fact, there's part 2 of that article just dropped earlier this week. You can check it out on the Strange Brew, and it talks about Dazed. It goes into a deep dive on Dazed and Confused.
Oh, okay, good.
But yeah, he, you know, it was funny because he was with Tim Rose, Jake Holmes. He was with Tim Rose in the early 60s, folk singer. And Tim Rose, you know, there was a Billy Roberts song going around that you might have heard of called Hey Joe that, you know, Jimi Hendrix eventually recorded. And there's always been a dispute over who wrote that song. Well, you know, Tim decided in the early 60s he was going to be like take half of the songwriting credit, you know, and Jake was with him at the time. And then, you know, fast forward, you know, several years later, and the same thing kind of happens to Jake with Led Zeppelin. And he initially just kind of shrugged his shoulders. He's like, yeah, okay, well, whatever, you know. And then I guess somebody shook him in the early 80s and said, dude, this thing has sold like 10 million records. You need to get your due. So he wrote a very polite letter to the management of Led Zeppelin, you know, who had recently broken up and never heard back. So, you know, I don't know what happened between then and 2010, but 2010 he decides to finally formally sue him and gets a ruling in his favor. And then, so Led Zeppelin going forward decides, you know, they credit it to Jimmy Page influenced by Jake Holmes, whatever that means. You know, it's like, but he does get songwriting credit. I think he got back royalties from it. But you know, in that it was kind of that early 70s kind of hippie ethos. Who cares? Let's all live and let live. And then, you know, at some point reality kicks in and like, hey man, this guy's really profited off my music and I need to do something about it. And it's you know, and it's really just what's right. And Jimmy Page has had that happen a lot. Like he didn't credit Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You to Ann Braden, who wrote it. You know, the Stairway to Heaven sounds a lot like the opening sounds a lot like Taurus, which was a song by Spirit in 1968. He's done it a few times. He has a track record. So I don't think when he went
Pun
to
intended.
the court, he didn't really have a leg to stand on. So, you know, Jake eventually did get his just desserts. But you should. I think obviously proper credit should always be given.
It's interesting, too, by the way. This story is so bizarre and weird. I don't know if you ever heard it, Lindsay, the Genuine Imitation Life Gazette, which is the Frankie Valli one-attempt album, The Four Seasons, of doing a psychedelic rock and roll album that Holmes had a large part to play in. And Frank Sinatra heard that album and decided that he wanted to have Bob and Jake produce his album, right? It's a really strange story.
Yeah. Totally is. And it's a great album. I love the Genuine Imitation Life Gazette. I think it's one of their best works. And it was, you know, Bob Gaudio, founding member of the Four Seasons and one of the principal songwriters, along with Bob Crew, he was a Jake Holmes fan. He would go see him play at the bitter end in Greenwich Village, which and Holmes' manager was Fred Weintraub, who owned it. So he got to play like a couple nights a week, and he would play that song, Genuine Imitation Life. And Bob loved it, and they recruited him they wanted to go in a different direction, following Sgt. Pepper, like so many other big name acts did, like the Stones and the Who and the Kinks, and the Four Seasons jumped into that fray too. And they wrote this album that was markedly different. It was a step in a different direction, but it also sounded like them. It had their trademark sound, and it was just kind of a commentary on the way things were going in the late 60s, the shift in culture, the shift in norms and everything. And, they got together for 6 months, he and Jake, and they wrote this album, and they released it, and to great promotion, and they did, trying to reach the college market, and it just fell flat because, kind of like I wrote in my book about the Mamas and the Papas, after Monterey Pop Festival, anybody who sang harmony or wore matching suits was instantly passé. So they had to fight against that, But yeah, like you said, Frank Sinatra and Frankie Valli were friends. He played in that album and he loved it, and he commissioned Bob and Jake to write an album for him. That's how we got Watertown.
Scott, my father who listens is texting right now. He wants to let you know, this is very important breaking information.
Breaking news from D.
Breaking news. Got some music?
He was, beep, 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 beep. He was in the movie Dillinger, and Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and Papas, the last surviving member, was in it as well. So he says the movie that when he starred in Dillinger with her. Now, by the way, he was an extra rocking on a porch somewhere, by the way. So, but he wants to let you know that. Okay. But anyway. Cool. He did play his own role. But speaking of Bob Gaudio, which, by the way, is such a cool last name, Jake's concept albums with Bob, they didn't get the recognition they deserved, at least at the time. But now they're hailed as these masterpieces. And it's always shocking to me when, that it inevitably always happens that they were a great after their time, before their time. And what do you think makes music like that's too ahead of its time? Why do we only realize it brilliance decades later, as it pertains, let's say, here to Jake and Gaudio's concept records?
Well, I think sometimes you can be too close in the moment, like especially in the late 60s. There's such a polarizing time. You had the Vietnam War going on, all the civil rights stuff and stuff, and the country was divided, much like we see it today, and it was I think there's just people that were instantly dismissive of something like that. Like there's really nothing controversial about the Genuine Imitation Life Gazette album, but I'm reading reviews of it from the time, and this is a protest album. It's like that's not really a single protest song on there. It just sounds a little different, and it's just a step in a different direction. And then you got the old fans who they want to hear I Got You Under My Skin and Big Girls Don't Cry and Sherry, and it's like, what is this? You're trying to sound like all those new bands out there. So, I think our emotions get wrapped up in it. And, I'm guilty with that too. I'm a huge Springsteen fan, and, I was anything after he broke up with the E Street Band in the late 80s, I was like, what is this? But, I go back and I revisit it, and, it's actually pretty good. What was I thinking at the time? But so we can get a little bit too close to our heroes, to our idols and musicians, and I think that's what it is. And when the dust settles, we look back and say, you know what? After further review, like on replay in a football game, it's like that was actually a really good album. And when subsequent generations like me come in and we listen to the Frankie Valli album, my mom was 18 when that album came out, so hadn't had me yet. So it's like. And when I listen to it, I say, this is pretty good. Have you heard this song, Wall Street Village Day? Listen to this alliteration. It's incredible.
So it's saying, get out of our own way. Just appreciate it for what it is. Roger that. Understood.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Electric Stories, by the way, is a great song. And you made me think of something, Scott, because, Lindsay asked that question about not being understood in your own time. And I realized why the Beatles get away with it. and they are the only ones who actually transform before people's very eyes. For everybody else, it's like, wait, why weren't we doing this all along? And then there's this an abrupt shift, that it suddenly it isn't, Dawn and Walk Like a Man and all of that suddenly are gone, and they're replaced by, by the Gazette. This is interesting because what the Beatles did was you can track it. Rubber Soul, Revolver, slowly but surely we watch them change. And there are bits and pieces of what is to come, whereas everybody else just kind of puts their fans through whiplash. And there must have been some sense of people being posers, too, like those guys are just trying to cash in on the Beatles.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
it's so interesting, Lindsay, because the Beatles really do slow boil. They do a slow boil on the lobster. You don't even realize they've changed until they have. But you could see it coming. Am I making sense?
Yeah, and I would put Bob Dylan in that category too. These are two groups, two artists that just kind of led the way, and then they changed, and everyone followed. Like, yeah, let's do that. And so it does look like you're cashing in on something like that. Especially when somebody else is leading the way, but. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. It's a negative way to frame it. But just to follow a trend, I don't think that's bad.
I want to talk about current state of songwriting real quick. But Dre, you wanted to ask about a movie real quick. What was it?
All right, I'm coming in. I got to hit all the buttons. All right, Scott, have you ever seen the? I think it's basically a documentary movie on whenever it was Jimmy Page, I think, The Edge, and Jack White. The movie was called This Might Get Loud, or It Might Get Loud.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
Oh,
but I remember when it came out.
Okay, it came out around 2008, and I wanted to get your personal take on it. But hey, we can save that for next time.
More homework assignments, Scott. There you go. Come back and talk about what Lindsay went, and at the end of the whole thing, we'll be like, and now time for the movie review.
Yeah, I just want to talk about one moment in that movie that just blows my mind. That's such a beautiful moment. Is in the movie, like they all talk about their special riffs that they get, and I think it was. I'm not sure if it was Immigrant Song or which one it was, but he's sitting there doing the riff, and you see an Edge and Jack White just stare at him with just complete admiration and respect, and just seeing them, like, the Edge is almost like holding back a tear of excitement. And I was like, man, I just wanted to see if you saw that or heard that, but hey, man, next time.
No, but I can totally understand it. I mean, this is the guy they both of them grew up listening to, and gave them the direction of their lives, their calling, and just to see him play it in front of them, that's got to be a pretty incredible thing.
Oh yeah, because real quick, and I'll let y'all go. I'm sorry, I don't mean to bull rush the conversation, but it starts with Jack White literally making a guitar out of a bottle and a 2x4. So it sets the standards. But I'll get out of your hair. Thank you for that, Scott.
Yep.
So I was just thinking about with Jake Holmes. I was thinking about. And this is quite a stretch, but it came to my mind, the idea. So Casey Musgraves here in country music, before she came on the scene, she wrote the song Mama's Broken Heart. Miranda Lambert ended up getting her hands on it, stealing it, depending on who you ask, and putting it out. And it was sort of a riff between them because Casey really wanted to release it. Same but different. Maren Morris first comes to Nashville. She wasn't wanting to be an artist. She wrote that song. She's been written several songs. She came in to be a songwriter and wrote songs for a lot of people. And then she wrote My Church, and her publisher was like, you have to release this. You need to be an artist. And she was sort of pushed into that. It wasn't her goal. It wasn't her intention. And it became a huge smash hit that put her on the map. But I was thinking about those kind of things as it pertained to Jake, and granted, both of those women I mentioned did go on to become household names themselves. But sometimes the most influential figures in music aren't the headliners, as we know. They're the ones in the background who make these quiet shifts to the soundscape. Where does Jake Holmes fit in that category? And I guess or who else would you put in that kind of unsung influencer list as it pertains to rock and roll?
Well, the people I would put in that list are really some of those great songwriting teams from the early to mid-'60s, like Jerry Goffin and Carole King. And then, of course, Carole King went on to be tremendous success in the 70s. But, for the first 10, 15 years of her career, she was just known as a songwriter. And then, you got Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, and then Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield, Burt Bacharach and Hal David, people like that just really moved groups forward and influenced songwriters. And, you had the Animals and the Rolling Stones and, like Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller and, just cutting their songs, and Elvis and all that stuff. So those are the people I would put. Wouldn't put really Jake in that category with him because he didn't really write any hit songs. But he influenced when you influence Led Zeppelin, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and Frank Sinatra, you've done something pretty good with your career. And you write their arguably their most groundbreaking, influential. I wouldn't say maybe not influential, but creative albums. That's saying something. And then to go on and be one of the preeminent jingle writers, in the 70s and 80s. That's a pretty good career. I would trade mine with him any day.
One of the other really great, and the other great thing about the article, as you guys can tell from the conversation, is that if you take all the bits and pieces that you've assembled here, the albums, the songs, some of the movies you make mention of, you could do a strange thing where you watch Rosemary's Baby. You could listen into the genuine article. You could listen to that, then watch Rosemary's Baby, then listen, to Watertown, and get this really weird sense of the world that we're kind of moving through at this point in regards to the cultural mores of the time, the energies of people, and all of this stuff is kind of lurking in here because Sinatra is coming out of his very contentious divorce with Mia Farrow when Watertown gets written. And they really write the music to the man, don't they? And it's all we got time for. I'll let you wrap up. I'll get you the final word here. But they really do create something magnificent for Sinatra here, don't they?
Oh, it really was. The album is, it's a heartbreaking subject, but, it's Frank delivering it. So he makes it compelling with just his singing and his phrasing and this warm, rich baritone, he brings reality to the songs because he's going through it. And I don't even know if Jake really knew it at the time when he wrote it, because it's not like he wrote it with Frank and, around. And I don't know, I can't say what the tabloids were. He might've had some kind of knowledge of it, but, but Jake was really writing about his own experience because he had been divorced and he did, lose a child in the divorce and just writing from that perspective and have a guy like Frank just bring raw authenticity to it. It was really powerful. And it's amazing. It was an album when it was released. It was another dud, at least in terms of sales, and has gone on to become recognized as one of his best albums.
Scott Shea, come to be recognized as one of our favorite guests. Come on, you can head on over to ScottSheaAuthor.com. That's SHEA, ScottSheaAuthor.com. Also find all his articles over at thestrangebrew.co.uk, but you can find out more on his website. Part 2 of this article is out now that we've been talking, and we're going to have him back because he has to watch a movie and look up one of an artist and dive deep for us. So we'll remind you of what we need from you, Scott.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, per usual, for making the time for us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.